creates a really rich and ripe period for creativity, imagination, as we think about how we solve some of the world's biggest and most important issues.
Okay, thank you, Margaret, for those initial remarks. Juan, Pablo, tell me, I mean, that's good framing by Margaret there. What does it mean in practice for a big company in Latin America?
Well, I think Margaret brings a very important point about how do we approach social issues, how do we approach environmental issues, are they core to the business, is this philanthropy? And I think the answer should be for every company that social and environmental issues and what we're living today, which is a pandemic, it has to be core to the business. It has. Sorry, this is home office, so you just heard my wife saying it's time for lunch. But I'll continue saying that social and environmental issues need to be core, and we've lived through this, and it has been interesting how the things that we do every day, our products or solutions, come to the surface, and we ask ourselves two questions. Is what we're doing good for society and good for the environment? If the answer is yes, and then if this is aligned to our core business, our purpose, and our values, if the answer again is yes, then we're doing the right thing. And I can talk about the specific examples on what we do, which is connectivity, water and food security, agriculture, etc. But I'll let Stanley talk first, maybe.
Juan, Pablo, you know, I knew I was already grateful to you for participating today, but the fact that you're doing it during lunchtime is a sacrifice that I truly admire. So thank you, thank you for that.
I'm sorry for it.
No, it's okay. All of us have had at least one moment like that since this all started, and you'll see that there's a door behind me, so you just never know who's going to come walking through that one. Stanley, let's go over to you. Has there ever been a moment like this in your history doing business, not just in the region, but globally? Is there anything you can compare this to? And what are your reactions to kind of what has been said so far?
Well, first of all, Juan Pablo's on a Mexican clock, so his lunch is still possible. Second, I'll be honest with you, to me, the social issues have been a lot harder than they are the environmental issues at this point. I think the environmental issues coming in are the ones we were taking care of, looking at. I think there's new opportunities under the environmental issue coming out of COVID. But the real problem is dealing with the present for me. I look at it this way. I think with regard to how people behave and how the health authorities or institutions deal with COVID is a real war. And I see the economic side as being a restructuring. I divide the two as sort of, this is something we need to attack, we need to learn how to take care of. And the other one is something it's a lot harder to do with the human aspects of downsizing a company. What do you do for people besides the legal part? How do you prepare them to maybe go on? Hopefully in some of the ones that you've had to let go, you've given them skills that will allow them to get another job in a very difficult environment. So to me, the hardest thing has been the HR, the human side of this thing, because there's even companies that are operating, those have had very little change. My problem is besides Copa, I deal in different businesses. Some are up and running like nothing happened, and other ones are completely shut down like an airline, hoping to start up again little by little. And in the HR issue, one of the things that I think is important is how can you keep the talent? Because you really don't know if you're going to bounce back, or you don't know how you're going to bounce back that quickly. So in the HR issue is not only how do you keep people when you're shut down, but how do you keep talent so that you have them tomorrow when you need them, if hopefully you have the opportunity of needing them.
What's your imperfect answer to that? I mean, how have you seen that dealt with effectively so far?
Effectively, I would say that, a lot of people are working remote, so those people are talented and you're paying them, et cetera, and going forward. I think the real problems in some of the cases is working with unions. In other words, how do you spread the work, and don't just leave it for a few? Can you work partial hours, everybody? Or things like that we're still working out as we activate ourselves again, especially in the airline business. We started out, I would say we went through sort of 3 stages. The first one was getting people to retire who we really don't want to bring back to work while this virus is going on. This virus is, I always say, a friend of mine says, at our age, meaning mine, we're filet for this animal. So we have to stay out of its way. And so part of the problem was getting people to retire who weren't ready to retire, who were still very productive, but they're over 60 years of age. Another one was finding volunteers, people who are willing now to leave the company for other reasons, maybe home domestic reasons, maybe. And then the third one was actually making decisions on who you can keep and who you cannot keep. The third one is still ongoing. The volunteer one, sort of the door is still open in most of the companies. We haven't filled the quota. So we're dealing with those HR issues, I would say, much more than I really have on my mind, the environmental issues. I like the environmental issues, and I think they will be important coming out of this, but I don't see them as immediate.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead, and then I want to ask a question about the environment.
I totally agree with Stanley that the people issue is the most important one, and I just wanted to comment about the everyday challenges of dealing with countries where the government is not doing everything that they should be doing, and how companies have to chime in to try to fill in that gap. And we've had issues in Mexico, we have had issues in Ecuador, specifically in Guayaquil. And this is not about having to lay out people or not. This is about protecting the people from dying. And some of them have died during the lockdown just because the overwhelmed health systems in different countries. So I just think that's another important topic to comment maybe later.
So that is important. In some ways, from a private sector perspective, correct me if I'm wrong on this, it's an operational issue. I want to talk about kind of the ethical side of this, even before we get into the environment, which is, are companies in these environments, as you correctly point out, where you have governments that kind of are on a full spectrum from, in the region in particular, there are some governments that are doing really well. But that's not the experience of most of the countries. So is it therefore incumbent upon the private sector in some of these places to step into that void and try to protect the welfare not only of their own people, but of the population at large?
Well, I think the answer is yes, we have to do everything we can. I was talking about issues in Guayaquil and Mexico. We have to have now a support line, phone support line for medical assistance. And we have a program that is a Padrino program that checks every day on all the vulnerable employees. And these are things that whenever the system doesn't do it, you have to come in and do it, because at the end of the day, we always say in business that cash is king, but the most important thing is not cash, is employee commitment and employee health.
Margaret, what have you seen globally on this question?
Yeah, I think that I think this is going to be an exceptionally interesting period of time. And we are starting to see some very interesting thinking on partnerships with government and with the private sector, right? So how capital is allocated is going to be probably different than the way it has been before. So if you think about in investment management professionals, they're faced with an extraordinary conundrum of exceptionally low interest rates, largely driven by central bank intervention. At the same time, asset prices have been going up as a result of that very low interest rate. So you have some interesting financial dimensions that will be extraordinarily challenging for private sector companies trying to create appropriate returns, so managing expectations and then the risks associated with it. The ethics of that and the trust are the thing that underpin the whole thing. And our surveys show that there is a denigration when there's no trust, no surprise. That information, the ability to influence and innovation are going to be key factors for building that trust. And you're doing it against a backdrop where, as Stanley and Juan rightly point out, there's an absence of leadership certainly at federal levels of government, and it's certainly not exclusive to any one region.
Well, let me just read a couple of examples here of concrete specific actions by the private sector in Latin America. Back in May, SC Johnson announced a $2 million donation to Latin American organizations on the front lines of the fight against COVID-19. Grupo Modelo produced hand sanitizer to donate to Mexico's public health system. Ambev has done similar things in Brazil. HSBC Mexico donated $900,000 to support health professionals via a foundation to Juntos por la Salud, a private-public partnership. A Chilean paper products corporation has donated masks. I mean, this is Colombia-based Grupo Sura donated 1.2 million of PPE. I mean, this has been all across the board. And look, my understanding, somebody who's been following the region for 20 years, but like you said, Margaret, this isn't even really a Latin America thing. These are expectations and prerogatives that are pretty new. I mean, it's hard to imagine companies having taken such an active role in this kind of thing even 10 years ago.
So I would love to get Stanley's perspective on this, but I dare say that anybody operating meaningfully in the capital markets right now has really never experienced anything like that, like what we're going through right now. We just haven't had a global pandemic. Can you imagine? Three things that really strike out in my mind. First of all, that we could go to working from home globally in a matter of weeks, that there weren't systemic failures as a result of that. And probably one of the most surveilled activities, which you never could have imagined would have been working from home, was trading. And yet we do all of those things. So where there's necessity and intention, we can make things happen. And if I'm in Toronto here. I left New York 5.5 months ago on the expectation I would be back 4 days later. And I say I'm here in Toronto. I actually have hardly left this room. So I just don't think any of us imagined that. And for the stresses that it creates, it also creates some amazing opportunities to reimagine and recraft that which we have held tight onto and believed couldn't be changed. But I would love to know, Stanley, I can't think of a period of time like this ever, with this kind of conditions.
I mean, there hasn't been, because, even if you go back and look at 08, 09, in Latin America, most of us didn't suffer as much as the United States and the rest of the developed world suffered. And if you go back to some of the other crises, we had our own crises back in the 80s, etc., that were difficult to deal with, but they were financial problems to deal with, not necessarily with the same human impact that we're seeing today, because we're seeing the human impact from a health and it's from a business. So there's two impacts happening to people that are very, very difficult. I asked myself after 100 days, what have I learned? And I didn't come up with a lot. I came up with a lot. Yes, a lot of things you're talking about, remote digitalization is going to move faster, some of things. But I think my number one learning was that the world was a lot more vulnerable than I ever believed it was. And this might be a forerunner to environment issues. In other words, is the world out of this going to learn that, this world is a lot more vulnerable than we think it is, and environmental issues are going to have to be dealt with. The other thing that I would comment to you though, Margaret, is the following. I think in the first 100 days, most of the ministries of health made a crucial mistake. The mistake that I saw, not only here, but in a lot of places, is there was orders given and not convincing done. You were ordered to stay home. You were ordered to do this. You were ordered to do that. You weren't convinced about a mask. You weren't convinced about how your social distancing or manner of dealing could affect other people. It was all sort of self-protection rather than saying, I could be affecting someone else. So I think the ministries on the whole assumed too much responsibilities and just dealt with it from that health issue and not necessarily from an economic issue or even sometimes from a sociological issue at home. With could be violence, etc. But I think now, after let's say 4 months, there seems to be a little bit more crack in the wall. People are now realizing we have to do something about the economics and we have to do something about the health at the same time. The most important thing for me is, are these conversations going to be sincere? Are they really going to get down and bare their souls and everybody get around the table? My way of expressing this is that we no longer can be sitting across the table from the other side. We all have to be at a round table dealing with the problem. Well, those are sort of just some reactions to what you were saying. I don't know, Juan Pablo, your reactions.
I think you're right on the last part when you say that this is everybody's problem. It's super important because we live in a world where everything is polarized and divided, and it's very easy to blame the other. But for example, again, in Mexico, our foundation with 45 other foundations started a group called Ensamble. And Ensamble is nothing other than a platform where all the foundations come together with their projects to help on COVID. And this started with the earthquake. So that if there is something that is of the interest of the other foundation, they can work on. And they divide the groups into healthcare, economic recovery, and vulnerable population. And of course, it's not only the foundations with companies that are doing what it needs to be done. They cannot do anything without the government and their support. So we spoke about a gap between what governments need to do and what they're doing in many places, and this gap being covered by maybe the private sector. But at the end of the day, it's not the private sector. It's a collaboration of the private sector with the government, with the local communities, with NGOs. That's the only formula that is really successful and that has real impact. And I've seen it in Mexico, but unfortunately, if you look at the graph, we are at a plateau and things are still very, very serious. So it hasn't been enough.
Brian, let me just make one comment quickly. You mentioned some of the, the initiatives that some of the companies have done. There's 1,000 more, as Pablo's mentioned. In Panama, a lot of people worked with the food banks. So there was a whole series of things that people, I think, on the whole, have stepped up to the plate and trying to make it viable. I think the real secret is what Pablo's saying is, even you take an NGO who has a project, wants to get something done, if you don't get all the elements, the effort, the money, and the government to cooperate, it becomes very difficult.
Well, I think that's right. And I hear kind of two themes emerging here. And one of them is the expectation or perhaps necessity for the private sector to be involved and really, I think, if we're honest, step into the breach in some of these circumstances where either polarization and a lack of trust or the operational inability of the government have left a vacuum. Here in the United States, and I've got some polling right here, July poll by Axios and Harris, that actually showed that trust in companies has increased amid the pandemic in the United States. And 75% of consumers, 75% agreed that, quote, companies were more reliable than the federal government in keeping America running. I don't know whether that's good news or bad news, because to me that shows what that's really showing you is kind of the dysfunction of the state itself. I have a second point there, but Margaret, I saw you leaning forward a bit.
No, go make your second point and I'll come back to your first one.
Okay. Or no, go ahead, because my second one is actually, I want to segue into the environment a little bit. So before we do that, if you have kind of a final thought.
Yeah, so I think one of the interesting things around the private sector and private companies stepping in the breach of government, again, I would be a half full kind of optimist. And I think if there was an opportunity for companies and investors to really break a bit of a log jam around the primacy or supremacy of shareholders at all costs to the other stakeholders, this actually is a moment where the world is looking at individual companies and their conduct. And there is an opportunity to step up and be almost heroes because, generally speaking, companies are not subjected to, the election cycle, and we have the ability to divert profits in some ways that hopefully business leaders can make an argument for. In a global pandemic, there's an opportunity to contribute. And if you think about that tilt of finance as a force for good and capitalism as a force for good, I mean it's been under siege for the last number of years, including on the environmental file. In part, think about things like stranded assets, right? Companies come in, Canada and certain parts of Latin and South America were big extractors of materials. And, we haven't valued the stranded assets that are left in communities, whether it's tailing ponds or whatever. This is an opportunity for companies to claim a little of that back and repivot the conversation, which balances shareholders and stakeholders. And so I hope it goes on. It's 100 days plus that we don't go back to the way it was before. And I don't think we're going back to the way it was before under all circumstances, because everyday citizens have a voice and a power they probably didn't have before. And I think you can take those roots all the way back to Occupy Wall Street.
Well, and that magically kind of segues into the question I wanted to ask, which, basically what you're saying is this increased spotlight on an imperative for companies to act in ways that are ethically, socially, environmentally responsible did not start with COVID-19. This is part of a trend that has been going on for maybe, as you say, maybe 10 years, maybe longer, prompted by social media, changing values, the millennial generation, and so on. And it extends to the environment. And I do want to talk about that briefly here. Two things, and this goes back to a point Stanley was mentioning earlier. An Ipsos survey in April revealed that 71% of respondents globally, global poll, believe that climate change is as serious a concern as the pandemic over the long term, and nearly 2/3 believe it should be prioritized as part of the economic recovery. One other data point, 91% of respondents to an Ipsos survey in April from Mexico and 85% from Brazil said that they would seek out products that are healthier and better for the environment because of the long-term impact of the virus. Juan Pablo, what do you think? I mean, how does that change business, not just for what you do, but for sort of vast sectors of the economy?
Well, I think I totally agree with the concern about climate change. And I have some comments in terms of how to approach trying to make a difference, both in a pandemic, when you talk about people and health, and also when you talk about the environment and biodiversity, which at the end of the day also overlaps with health and human beings. We've been talking about different efforts that are more local, like Ensemble or like others where you work with the government, with the municipalities, etc. But I think companies also need to think about societal innovation and how can we do things not only that concern our products and solutions, but how can we produce solutions that can have global reach. And an example of that is what Orbia is doing with NanoScent. NanoScent is a test for COVID that works like the breathalyzer. That you blow into a tube and it measures the alcohol levels. With this test, you blow into a tube and a chip inside analyzes the aroma of your breath and tells you in less than 30 seconds if you have COVID or not. Those kinds of things are not local. If you're able to succeed in that, you really make a difference for the health and for the coming back to work globally. So it doesn't matter if the challenge is a pandemic or climate change. The way to approach it is both local, understanding that partnerships and NGOs and the community with the government is key, but also trying to think outside the box and seeing with the right partnership also how can you move the needle in terms of these great challenges, because climate change, if you try to fight it only locally, then you won't achieve much.
Stanley?
No, it's something that, I think is on everybody's agenda, was on agenda. I would like to sort of move maybe a little bit now, saying, okay, are we going to work from home? What is the digital world going to play? How much faster is it going to play in this upcoming world? I mean, we have to assume that sooner or later we'll either learn to live with this virus or we'll get a vaccine for it. And then going forward, what comes out of this? And I see digitalization coming much faster than we ever imagined it. You see it every day. If people are going to go that way, whether you want to be there or not. It sort of reminded me many years, I'm trying to think, it was maybe 5-6 years ago, Facebook caught on that people were accessing them via the phones and not the computer. And it was going so fast, they had to stop everything to reformat what they were doing. So, if I think that what they learned back then by facing the real data that was coming in on them is what we need to see going forward. I think, people are not going to be going to a bank for a while and less every day. I think people are going to do a lot of things remotely. So I think that's one of the big things that has. And now, how does that play back to social things is I want to get to, I guess, in the last half hour.
Okay. Well, so we have a related question on this from the audience. And let me just say, for those of you who are here on WebEx, if you have a question, please share it via the WebEx chat function with the person identified as the moderator. And if you are joining us via webcast on Twitter, you can ask a question by basically putting in the handle of either ASCOA or America's Quarterly. We'll keep an eye on that. So here's the question related exactly to the point that you were just making, Stanley. And let me just read it verbatim. The ethics of going back to work, perhaps it's different in the sectors like finance, construction, and the airline business. We need them back, but some are reluctant and fear being infected. There are benefits and risks. And the issue of employers' liability, for example, is a big one, with rules that unless there is willful or gross negligence, businesses are exempt from employees' complaints. What are businesses doing? Here's the question. What are businesses doing in Latin America to protect themselves and mitigate the legal and ethical risks of liability or PR problems in the process of going back to work. Juan Pablo, maybe we'll start with you, and Margaret, maybe you could chime in on what you're seeing on that globally.
Well, I think it's pretty basic in terms of just being responsible in following the rules of every country. We operate in 43 countries, and it's different in each of them. So the first step is you have to do what you're allowed to do, but the second is you need to be responsible and make sure that you're taking, whether it's allowed or not, all the necessary measures in your plants, in the corporate office, etc. And we know what all those measures are: using a mask, washing your hands, not touching your face. But I think it's follow the rules and be responsible. More than that, I don't know, maybe Stanley, you can tell us more how a lawyer would do it.
I'm not a lawyer, so please don't. But look, I would say our attitude has been trying to do the right thing and not really worrying about the legal issues, to be honest. Very early, we did just the opposite. Under most health insurance plans, pandemics are not covered. In the insurance company, we made the early decision to cover pandemics, to cover COVID, not any pandemic, but to cover this pandemic. And we did it with a very logical thing. Fortunately or unfortunately, this is not a very expensive disease. To be very blank and blunt, if you're less than 50, you're 99% not going to be hospitalized. If you're over 50 or so, you're in much more danger. And even those people, there's a limited amount being hospitalized. And the ones being hospitalized don't linger very long, which is very unfortunate, but it's the truth. It's not the same as having a terminal ill patient on a cancer. And that person could be in an ICU for months. We know in this one that unfortunately, the ICU stay is relatively short, either because you don't make it or because the person does make it. So from an ethical point of view or from a liability standpoint, I don't think we've given it. I think we've looked at this thing of saying, we're going to do the right thing. We're going to do whatever the laws say. And on top of that, what else can we do for our people? What else can we do for, society around us? That's what we did in the insurance company. So I'm not looking at it really, worrying about the liability aspects of this thing. I think the other thing, there are some things that are important to do. A person doesn't lose his job because he's had COVID. You send him home, you get him isolated, you give him support, and then when he's over it, he comes back to work. Fortunately, that's what it is for a lot of people. I do think we have not paid enough attention separating the vulnerable from the less vulnerable. And one of them is age, and obviously the other ones are preconditions of hypertension, diabetic, lung problems, or other health issues that are serious. And I think that, if you really sit down and look at the stats, that's what it is. I think we should deal with that in the most responsible way possible. But I do not see a tremendous amount of claim coming out of this, unfortunately, just because of the nature of it, I guess.
Let me maybe take a little bit of a different tact on both the working from home and return to work. So I think, boy, have we ever gotten a lesson in physical or in personal hygiene, personal safety, and statistics. This is something we've all learned. Juan Pablo's comments around it's different for different jurisdictions around how that and different job functions around how that looks for returning to work is a very important one. And I think there are two aspects to it. There are vulnerable communities. Certainly, we know that different ethnicities are affected differently by COVID, as well as different ages. We've also learned that there is a great equalizer on things like working from home. We can work from home. If schools aren't opening, then how are we expecting parents to necessarily come home? What happens when you have intergenerational risk factors? And so I think that when we talk to asset management firms around the world, and when we look at CFA Institute, our own workforce, where we have societies in over 160 countries, and we have sort of affiliate groups, and we have offices in 9 different cities around the world, each response is different. And I think actually one of the things we are seeing is an opening up of understanding a much broader, the context for a much broader base of constituents, those people whose lives we didn't know much about, their personal life. Juan Pablo, we know it's lunchtime for you and that your wife is calling you for lunch. That is the new soundtrack of our work lives. You know, I've had late night meetings with people whose sons come up bare-chested with Spider-Man stickers all over them, and we carry on our meetings. I can tell you, when I started work, you barely talked about your kids as a woman because you thought somehow it would diminish your commitment and ambition around what you were doing. And now we know all of that's thrown out of the window. So we have the ability to personalize better. It also opens up talent pools for us differently. We had one CEO say, I used to have to be in London. Now I can look at talent in Liverpool. People who are commuting long distances now have the opportunity to balance. So I don't think it's an on or off switch. And while it's 5-6 months into this, I think over the coming years, we are going to see an unleash of creativity around work, around worker safety. And we're going to be able to reimagine that. And we have the technology to enable that. We're probably far behind in terms of the business thinking, the great psychology that will help us be better at it as business leaders, which will then drive ethics, right? I mean, ethics are at the center of it. But when you think about the longer term, when you think about the sustainability of your companies, where are we going to get talent from? What does that talent look like? How do we access it? How do we make it beneficial for both parties? I think we're going to find that this was the genesis that brought the previous 10 years of all these movements where we need more inclusion, particularly in the financial world, whether that's employment income, whether that's returns from the companies that you run that generate products and goods and services, but also returns for your investors. I think we're going to find this is like the moment that it all came together that probably lays the groundwork for the next 25 to 50 years. I suspect we will look back and see this as a real moment, a real kaboom moment in time.
Well said, Margaret. Thank you. And you've helped me transition into kind of the final part of this, or the final big issue that I have here, which Stanley alluded to earlier, which is, I suppose, for lack of a better term, social issues. You've all mentioned how COVID-19 has impacted certain populations much harder than others. And perhaps that is one reason why, it's not the only reason why, but perhaps it's one reason why we've intensified our conversation about race, not only here in the United States where I live, but in Brazil, which is the country that I spend most of my workday following. And we've seen variations on that in places like Colombia. I know some in Panama as well. There's been a version of this in Mexico. And the private sector, once again, has been at the center of it. Let me give you just a couple data points on this. Some companies have announced the rebranding of products to eliminate racial stereotyping and insensitive depictions in their products. Nestle announced in June the rebranding of the Colombian dessert that was called Beso de Negra. The Peruvian corporation Alicorp announced a rebranding of a line of desserts this June with kind of a similar name. Clorox did the same with a logo in Colombia also. What do you see happening in your country? And again, there's always a struggle, and I've been privy to some of these conversations between the inherent historical conservatism of private sector, especially public companies with shareholders of, well, maybe we should stay quiet right now and not be part of this discussion, versus this very modern need over the last 10 years or so that we've been discussing to be out there, because that's not only what shareholders demand, it's what customers demand.
I have a different reaction to some of that, Brian. To be honest with you, I think that some of these brands that are being eliminated or take it, I think it would be a good business to buy up the use of the name to use later on. I think there's been an overreaction to some of this, in the sense that I don't think, it was derogatory or meant to be derogatory, or people looked at it as derogatory. I think it's just easier for the company to play safe and change the brand, to be honest with you. It's, because today with 10 people protesting, it's going to cost me more with the lawyers than it is going to be worth it. So I don't know. That to me is sort of an overplay. A little bit of what Margaret was talking about earlier, and then I'd like to turn the page a little bit on you. The only thing I think, Margaret, is we all learned to work at home very quickly, but I find that some people are very productive and others are not being as productive after 3 or 4 months. To use a term that Jamie Dimon used the other day, he says there's a lack of combustion on Zoom or on WebEx. So he says, I thought it was a good expression. I'm giving him full credit for it, that we have in the office. We do have combustion, we do have interplay, and there's less mentoring in a way, because mentorings are moments that you spend with people, not necessarily being on a screen with them. So there's, I think the full impact of this and how we deal with it going forward is still out. It's too early. It's 5 months or 6 months or whatever you want to take it. But I mean, we'll learn, and it will be part of our ways. But I have my doubts about it also. Is it all I wanted to do? Brian, what I wanted to sort of take a few minutes, and I don't think a discussion like this is sincere if we don't talk about inequality and we don't talk about inequity. And I divide the two into two different things. Inequity to me is the lack of public services being given to some part of the population. And equality, we've all been looking for education to be the equalizer going forward. The problem with education is education takes a hell of a long time. So all of a sudden, I think we're coming bare with this problem of inequality coming out of this and inequity coming out of this. I've had a speech, and I'm going to steal 2 minutes of everybody's time, that basically I think the general population in Latin America is asking for 5 things, and the 6th one they should ask for, they're not asking for. They want public transportation. They want security in their barrios. They want somebody to pick up the garbage. They want water 24/7, and they want, and they should want education. That's the one that they are not as demanding as they are on when there's no bus and I have to pay the taxi. I know it. And the 5th one I left out is better health services from the government institutions. So those, I think, are what I call the inequities that we need to work on. We need to make better, because the lack of those makes poor people poorer. When they have to buy bottled water instead of having good water service 24/7, it makes people poorer. The inequality issue is another one that I'm sort of learning, I think, because of COVID. In Panama, and I'll give you the numbers quickly, the government touts that we spend $1,600,000,000 a year on subsidies. If I do the numbers, we're a population just over 4 million, so I'll cheat on the numbers, and we're 4.1, 4.2. I say we're 4 million, there's 5 per family, that's 800,000 families. That means that we're spending $2,000 a year per family on subsidies. If I take and say half the people need the subsidy and the others half don't, that means we're spending $4,000 a year on subsidies. That's $350 a month. In Latin America, or $325. In Latin America, that's a lot of money. And one of the things that I think is coming out of here is that we're not good at distributing whatever we're distributing. We're not good at spending what we're spending it. We've been growing bureaucracies. In Panama, we have the sobrenombre of saying a person in the government who doesn't do anything is a botella, is a bottle. And I think we would be a lot better with less botellas and more social support, because for every botella, I can probably help 3 families. So I think there's a whole thing that we need to now understand. A lot of the governments have reached out, tried to help people, and this is not going away. So I think we need to look at those, rebuild them better, rebuilding them technologically, make sure that, can we get to them electronically? Can we monitor them? One of the things that I worry about with the program here is I know how to add people, but I don't know how to take people off. That to me is the big issue. This support is not going to go away. How do we make it better?
Thank you, Stanley, for that panorama. And I know that a lot of what you said about Panama is true in a lot of the region's countries as well. I do want to kind of exercise the moderator prerogative here and offer Margaret and Juan Pablo a chance to react to this question about social issues, but also connect it back to inequality and some of the things, Stanley, that you were just mentioning. I guess, at some level, they all come back to this question that we've been not exactly dancing around. I think we've been talking about it directly, but it's a question that's on my mind, and I know it's on many other people's minds, which is, how exceptional is this moment? Is this a period that we're going to look back on and see all this clamor on social issues, on the issue of inequality, and think, gosh, we were in the midst of this terrible historic crisis and it prompted a re-examination, but really in practice, we sort of almost like elastic snapped back to something that was at least somewhat close to the status quo ante, the situation that we had before? Or is this a real divisor de aguas, right? Like, is this truly a new moment in terms of the way the public approaches some of these issues and what they expect from the private sector as well? I mean, Juan Pablo, come to you first and then go to Margaret. I mean, what do you think?
I think it is an extraordinary moment, and it could be a watershed moment. In terms of the societal issues like Black Lives Matter, in terms of race, gender, all of the issues that we're looking at, I believe that companies should take part of this, but not as a flavor of the month thing, just reacting by changing a name. It has to be part of the DNA, that no matter if we're living through a pandemic that is taking all of this sentiment to the surface, or an earthquake, or whatever it is, we then react. It has to be part of our purpose. It has to be part of our values. It has to be part of our everyday. We say at Orbia we want to advance life around the world, and we have an impact mark that measures women diversity, that measures green emissions, that also measures profitability. But our ambition is to really walk the talk in a certain way, not only react to the moment, but to really make part of our DNA, part of our purpose and our values, whatever we stand for. And depending on the company, depending on what your purpose and your values is, you can stand for different things. But I just criticize, or I don't agree with companies just reacting because this is the flavor of the month.
I think this is, Juan Pablo has characterized it really well. I think it's a watershed moment. Again, if I go back to kind of Occupy Wall Street, the Me Too movement, any number of these movements, and Black Lives Matter, which is now coming back again and has gone global and viral. You might say, what is the catalyst for this? What is the genesis? Why is it little fires everywhere that are combusting globally? And I think it really comes back to exclusion. And so when you think about that tension, it's too tense, right? We've pulled it too far. So inequality and inequity, basic rights, which Stanley, you pointed out, whether that's water, education, that just huge numbers around the world are excluded private sector has an extraordinary opportunity to help remedy that in so many ways. And if that opportunity is missed, my own view, I think shared by many, is that, people will come across the transom and take what they think is rightfully theirs because they have nothing left to lose. And both technology and social media enable that particular aspect of it. And so I think it's really incumbent on private sector and companies to think for the longer term, to think about that risk, return, and impact. And I think if we can get that right, while managing expectations, being probably more honest than we've ever been required to be, while balancing complex issues, right? While balancing all of those competing priorities, we'll probably come out of it better. What I do think is that in December, I had the opportunity to sit with a number of CEOs, including Paul Pullman, who was leading a discussion on ESG, and the E was all about carbon. And as we know, in the last sort of 6 months, call it between June of 2019 and up until COVID, everything was about carbon. Everything was about the environmental impact. And it was pretty headline stuff. What we were seeing were pension plans that look at the Dutch pension scheme, where they had done everything right. Their beneficiaries had done everything right. And they were having to remake those contracts about delivering on those obligations. It is going to behoove all of us to have those complex conversations to help people better understand, and it's going to have to be a balance amongst competing stakeholders. And there's necessity, urgency, and everybody knows it. There is no quarter that is exempt from this. And so I think we will look at it as a watershed moment. Will it be linear? No. Will it end up exactly where we think it will? No. Is it really hard? Yes. But we have so many minds right now that are on it that I would encourage Stanley and Juan Pablo and all of the business leaders in your space. CFA Institute is deeply, deeply committed to protecting investor outcomes. But we do think about those three dimensions: risk, return, and impact. And I can tell you, we will be very supportive of those initiatives that are fair and equitable. And so I have to say I'm thrilled to have been on this panel with all of you, because it's been a really robust conversation, and one I will take back to our quarters and share what's gone on in the discussion we've had today.
Well, thank you, Margaret. And I want to just go back. There's one question that I want to address, and we have 3 minutes to do it because we promised to finish by the top of the hour, and Juan Pablo has to eat his lunch. But the question is, and look, this one's a little bit of a test because, I'm a journalist. We're cynical by nature. It's going to be really easy to say no to this question. Okay, but are you ready? Maybe 30 seconds from each of you on this. Do you think the COVID crisis will push the public sector to raise the bar in terms of ethics, transparency, efficiency, and so on? I mean, how hopeful are you? We've been so focused on the private sector here. We haven't talked about the public sector that much. I mean, Stanley, maybe 30 seconds from you, and then Juan Pablo, you can have the final word on this.
Look, I think they better, because I think the population is a lot more aware of it. I mean, it has nothing directly, but if you wanted to take it in a moment of action, look what happened in Beirut last week. So it's that's probably compressed into a couple of days. But like Juan Pablo said, look, it's going to be a different world. How different it's going to be, I don't know. The only thing I'd add to, and the reason it's going to be a different world, is that job recovery is going to take a lot longer than what we're talking. We can get a vaccine tomorrow, and there won't be job recovery the next day. So there's going to be this social aspect, this corporate aspect, the environmental aspect, all these aspects we've talked about today, Brian, and thank you for inviting me. Margaret and Juan Pablo, I leave it to you guys to close.
I'll just take the last 15 seconds to answer and say that I think things will change. and I do believe they will change for the better. If we look at what happened with the Spanish influenza in the 1920s and how the healthcare system changed and how it affected vaccines and the pharma industry, the change has been incredibly positive. And I think that in many ways that will also happen, not only in healthcare, but also in being more transparent and coming with incredible innovations that will help society and the environment.
I'm told
I'm going to say yes on the public sector. It's going to be longer and more difficult and more painful than we probably would like or expect.
We have a special guest who wants to say goodbye. Susan, are you there? I can't hear you, Susan, unfortunately.
Hi, Susan.
We can see you.
Oh, the audio's...
She's on mute.
The audio's not working. She tried to unmute, but we can't hear her.
Now she's unmuted.
Well, in any case, I don't know why it's not either, but you're waving goodbye. Juan Pablo, what's for lunch? Do you know?
I have no idea.
All right.
I'll tell you later.
It's not a restaurant. It's not a restaurant. He doesn't get to order.
Okay. Well, buen provecho. Gracias a todos.
Bye.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, everyone.